The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
I mean, the presentation itself takes anywhere from 20 to 25 minutes, but, you know, like I said, I can make that quicker, shorter, longer, whatever works for you guys. Obviously, the presentation tonight is retirement, making your money last. My name's Chad Bearce. I work with Edward Jones Investments down the road here in Easton. I live in Foxborough, work in Easton, so a nice little local base here to draw off of, but I appreciate you joining me tonight. So when I'm working with clients, everything comes back to this 5-step process, and it all works together to include your entire financial plan, whether it's starting out as a younger individual, going into your prime earning years, or then even going into retirement, which is kind of what we're going to focus on this evening. But step one, especially when I first meet with clients or prospective clients, is where are you at today? What do you have? What does it look like? What sort of accounts are these monies in? Second would be, where would you like to be in the future? Obviously, they kind of play off of each other, and as you'll see, each step kind of segues right into the next. So what you have now, where would you like to be in the future? These are really long, good conversations to have, and these are thoughts that you should be having by yourselves anyway, but then meeting with somebody and fully fledging out those ideas are really integral. Third, can you get there? This is ultimately kind of what you come to a financial advisor for. Obviously, you guys have a frame of reference in terms of what you have, where you want to be, and what the likelihood is. But again, having this conversation is something that I have with all my clients. Number 4, how do you get there? That's kind of where I come into play, whether it's being a little bit more efficient with your taxes, or maybe the way that trusts are established if you're near the estate tax threshold, things like that. And then 5th, how do you stay on track? That comes back to review. I stay in touch with my clients at least quarterly. Every once in a while, I'll check in just to see how things are going. But they do also have monthly statements that come out, and they have online access if they want to check up on their accounts. So when we think about retirement, ultimately it comes down to, what are the variables that go into making sure that your money lasts throughout retirement? And there's kind of 3 main ideas that we're going to touch on today. First is expenses. Obviously, making your money last in retirement involves being a little bit more conscious of how you're spending, how much you're spending, what you're spending on. Second, life expectancy. Obviously, this is something we don't necessarily have as much influence over. Obviously, we can to a certain extent, depending on our diet, how we exercise, things like that. But usually once you're getting into your retirement and into your retirement ages, you can't really influence it too much. And then lastly, inflation. Again, not something we necessarily have too much influence over, but it is something to factor into your retirement plan regardless of what it looks like. Brief agenda for this evening. We're going to go over plan for the expected, prepare for the unexpected, position the portfolio for both, and then lastly, review. Like I said earlier, everything comes back to reviewing. You can have a plan, but ultimately, 99% of the time, something's going to be changed, whether it's on your end or on the more macro level with the economy as a whole. So reviewing consistently is a really, really good idea. Plan for the expected. What does that mean? Everybody has a different picture for what their retirement looks like. For you guys, you guys are big into exploring the libraries locally, and being truthful with yourself as you prepare and plan for retirement is really, really important. There are some people that are big spenders, and acknowledging that fact and building that into the plan is really, really important. Whereas if maybe you're going to be a little bit more frugal with your money, again, factor that into the plan. Maybe you don't have to save so much up. Maybe you can retire a little bit earlier. Things like that change the retirement plan entirely. And again, ultimately it all comes back to how long can you make your money last in retirement, and whatever your retirement looks like is going to influence what that picture looks like. How much will it cost? Again, kind of coming back to the expenses section that I touched on earlier. We kind of break this down into 3 different buckets. And again, this isn't necessarily rocket science, but it's something to emphasize and hammer home the point. We break it down into necessary expenses. That's food, housing, heat, electricity, your everyday necessities in order to live a comfortable life. Second would be the discretionary expenses. That kind of comes back to your hobbies and your interests and things like that. Whether you're a golfer, let's say, and you want to weigh the costs and pros and cons of getting a really expensive golf membership to some really, really nice golf course, or do you want to take more of a public route and maybe save some money that way. Again, it ultimately comes down to what your retirement looks like, what you want it to look like. But again, that would be under the category of discretionary expenses. And then lastly here is taxes. Obviously, what's the saying? There's 2 givens in life, death and taxes. There's nothing we can really do to influence whether you're going to be paying taxes, but we can influence how much, with what regularity, things like that nature, how the taxes are categorized. But again, ultimately coming down to what retirement costs, ultimately that's up to whatever your retirement picture is. Where will the money come from? So how will we be paying for this retirement? It's going to come down to 2 different buckets, both outside income, that being Social Security, pension, things like that, or savings and investments. Those are retirement accounts. Maybe it's a 401k, IRA, maybe you have an annuity, maybe you have a brokerage account that you've saved up over the years. But again, when you consider where the money's coming from and how you're paying for your retirement, it's going to come from one of those 2 buckets, outside income and savings and investment. And having a good mix of the 2 is really where you want to find your balance, so to speak. The income gap, what does that mean? So when we're thinking about the income gap, what we're really saying is your expenses subtract your outside income, and that's where the rest is going to come from your savings and investments. So that income gap between your outside income, let's say Social Security for this example, and your expenses is your income gap. And that's where we can come into play in terms of influencing what your retirement accounts look like, how much you've saved up, things like that. So, for example, I think in your packets you'll see, it may be later on in the presentation, so I may be jumping the gun a little bit, but let's say, for example, you expect to spend $50,000 in retirement, and you have $30,000 coming from Social Security. That income gap would be $20,000 coming from your savings and investment. And I think it is a little later in the presentation. When we consider that income gap and what it represents, it comes down to withdrawing from your retirement accounts. Again, whether it's a 401k, IRA, things like that. And there's different guidance in terms of how we expect and suggest our clients to withdraw from their retirement accounts later in life. Obviously, when it comes down to it, if you want to spend X and your Social Security is only going to cover Y, you need to fill that gap with Z. And that's where withdrawals come out. Now, as you get a little older and you start withdrawing, you can be a little bit more aggressive in how you withdraw. But generally, let's say somebody decides they want to retire a little early in their early 60s, we suggest they withdraw between 3 and 3.5% from their retirement accounts. And what that's going to do is, again, ensure that the money lasts throughout. If they start withdrawing 5 to 6% from their retirement accounts in their early 60s, there's a very real chance that they may run out of money at some point in the not too distant future. And that's an important part, especially as you start retirement. Acknowledging the fact that you can't be so willy-nilly and taking as much as you want from your retirement savings, because at the end of the day, you don't know how long you're going to live. Your family history may be somewhere in the mid-80s to upper 80s, but maybe you have a really long lifespan and you live into your 90s or maybe even into your upper 90s, and there's a chance you may run out of money if you start withdrawing 5-6% in your early 60s. So this is a really, really important concept to use and think about as you begin withdrawing from your retirement accounts. Reliance rate. What is the reliance rate? That is kind of coming back to the income gap. Reliance rate is the percent of expenses covered by savings and investments. So again, that income gap as a percentage of your overall expenses. And you don't want to be overly reliant on your savings and investment, because again, that comes back to the concept of if you're overly reliant on your savings and investments, there is a chance that at some point you may run out of money. I'll go ahead and stop. I feel like if there's any questions that you guys may have, again, don't hesitate to interrupt. If I'm going a little too quick, tell me to slow down, but I guess we can move on.
So
Sure.
back to that slide
Yep.
before.
The withdrawal rate?
Yeah, I mean, that looks like that assumes like 25 to 30 years.
Yeah, generally,
I'm thinking maybe mid-90s.
we look towards like actuarial tables in terms of how, lifespans are expected to get a little bit longer as society develops a little bit. And so, yeah, late 80s, early 90s, that's kind of where we expect our planning to last. And again, especially in retirement, we'd rather overestimate your lifespan than underestimate it. So if we plan for your lifespan to be 95 years and it goes till 89, we've built a buffer there. But let's say the vice versa happens. When we plan for your life to be 89 years and you live till 95, that's where we kind of get into a little bit of a pickle. And so again, coming back to, you're right, upper 80s, mid 90s, that's kind of where we find the suggestion being where the lifespan ought to be. And then again, that can differ depending on personnel. Some people, like I said earlier, have a generational, for whatever reason, their family lives a longer life than some other people, and that's something that we factor into the financial plans as well. But again, the withdrawal rate, if you take nothing away from this evening, this is a really, really good thing to take away from it. And we'll kind of segue into this right now. Let's think of Tom and Julie, for example. They're in their early 60s. They want to retire at 64, and their full retirement age is 66 in terms of Social Security. And kind of, it goes off of what I was talking about earlier. Their income gap is $45,000. So they want to spend $65,000 in retirement. Their Social Security, or in other words, outside income, is $20,000. They need to fill that income gap with $45,000. That's a pretty sizable amount to consider, and we'll touch on that in a little bit, but they're looking at a withdrawal rate of 6% given a portfolio of $750,000. So they want to withdraw $45,000 from an overall portfolio of $750,000, and they're in their early 60s. That's a 6% withdrawal rate. And if we go back to here, that's double what we suggest. And they're very much putting themselves in a position where they may run out of money at some point in the not too distant future. And even if the situation presents itself where they don't run out of money at some point, they're putting their retirement and their livelihoods at risk by having this 1 year where they're withdrawing 6% from their portfolio. And one thing, I'll kind of come back to this slide while we're here. Generally, somewhere in the range of 4% is a comfortable withdrawal rate regardless of age. And the thought process behind that is if we withdraw 4%, history has shown you're able to make that back in the market over the course of the year, where you're not necessarily going to be dwindling your savings over the years. Instead, you're going to remain somewhat level. And in reality, sometimes people, it's tough to wrap their heads around this, but in some instances, you actually end your life with more retirement savings than you start your retirement. And again, it all comes back to what you're withdrawing and what your expenses look like and sort of staying within that budget. So we'll go back to Tom and Julie. They have a withdrawal strategy of 6%. Again, really, really high given their time. Excuse me. Sure, no, please.
$750,000.
Yep.
if it's returning 6%,
Yep.
that's what you're saying is their income is around 45,000 non accounting for taxes, then that principal is staying kind of stable?
In theory it is,
Yes.
but that's assuming a 6% return, which, you know, as you get a little older, you want to allocate your portfolio a little bit more towards fixed income as opposed to equities. And, you know, depending on how the fixed income returns look like for that given year, you may actually only return 4.5%, 5%, in which case you're actually starting to dwindle your savings. So that's a really good point, and you are right. If, let's say you want to remain fully invested into equities through your retirement, which I don't suggest, but in theory, the market has returned somewhere in the range of 11 to 12% over the last, 90 to 100 years. However, let's say they have a really, really bad year and the market returns negative 20%, which is not, unheard of, and you withdraw 6%, all of a sudden you're down 26% of your portfolio, and that's where it gets to be a slippery slope. So yes, in an up market, you can kind of withdraw a little bit more, but you don't want to get into the habit of that because ultimately nobody in the world can tell you exactly what the market's going to do this coming year. So the withdrawal with rate strategy is a really good place to find yourself. So again, kind of reiterating the point, they're going to withdraw too much from their portfolio this year, given our guidance. What can we pull on, what levers can we pull on to kind of remedy this situation? Well, first we could reduce their spending goals. If you'll remember, their expenses for the year are $65,000. Let's say we bring that down to even $55,000. A little bit of a smaller percentage will be the reliance rate, and in effect, the withdrawal rate will be decreased as well. So again, maybe they decrease their spending goals. Second, maybe they work a little bit longer, delay retirement. Now, obviously, I'll kind of jump to the point. None of these outcomes are ideal, regardless of whether it's working part-time, delaying retirement, or reducing their spending goals. And all of these trade-offs are a direct reflection of overspending their retirement and over-withdrawing from their retirement portfolios. So again, delaying retirement, working part-time, none of these are ideal scenarios, and none of these are, especially if you go into retirement, and I've seen this happen, unfortunately, for some people. They go into retirement a little early, expecting to live this lavish lifestyle, and then 3-4 years down the road, they say, oh, shoot, and they have to go back into the workforce, even if it's not full-time. And, some people like to work part-time in retirement, and if anything, I think that gives them a little bit of a purpose, for lack of a better term. But you don't want to need to work. Because again, kind of coming back to that life expectancy thing, let's say you come down with a serious illness, or you have to replace your hip and you're not able to move. You can't work if you are in that scenario. So again, there's some downsides to having to work in retirement as well, even if it's part-time. But again, flexibility is the key. Ultimately, you don't want to have to rely on these levers being pulled on to increase your likelihood of success in retirement. Now we're going to go into preparing for the unexpected. Again, what does that mean? Well, what we'll see here are some different things that may occur in retirement and some things that may need to be factored into your retirement plan overall. Excuse me. So long-term care, for example, kind of on the top left there, that's a major thing that I go through with a lot of my clients, and is even becoming more prevalent given the cost of healthcare, as I'm sure you guys are aware of. Long-term care is a major thing that needs to be factored into any successful retirement plan. Now, there's different ways that you can factor that in, whether it's long-term care insurance, maybe an annuity with a hospitalization rider attached to it. Again, this isn't the time or place to go into too much detail on that, but long-term care is an unexpected expense that may come into your retirement plan that needs to be factored in. Living longer than expected. Again, what I mentioned earlier. Yes, you may expect to live to 90 years old, and that's great, But let's say you live to 100. All of a sudden, you're going to need your money to last a lot longer in retirement than you originally had planned for. And that's where that withdrawal rate comes in, is that you want to be conscious of where you're spending and how much you're pulling away from your retirement. Leaving a legacy, that's important for some people. Some people want to leave X amount of dollars to their children, grandchildren, whatever it may be. Maybe it's a charity, maybe it's a library. And so that's something that's important to them, and that's something that gets factored into their retirement plan. Let's look at Helen, for example. I have a little bit of a little blurb on Helen here. Helen will be retiring soon. Both of her parents are still alive. Her mother is 91 and her father is 93. Helen's grandparents also lived well into their 90s. Although Helen's parents are in good health, she has seen how their health care expenses have risen in recent years and are taking up a larger portion of their income. Helen is concerned not only about outliving her money, but also being able to afford health care. So kind of going back to a couple different points in the presentation this evening, if you'll remember way back to the beginning, what are the three sort of variables that influence a retirement plan's success in making sure your money lasts? Expenses, life expectancy, and inflation. So in this case, Helen is most concerned with life expectancy and then also the expenses of healthcare. So what we can do, what Helen can do, is factor that into her retirement plan. And again, this isn't quantitative stuff that we're doing. We're not necessarily talking about how her portfolio is allocated between bonds and mutual funds, or whether she's going to generate a 9% return versus a 13% return. That's not what we're talking about. I mean, that is something that we factor into a retirement plan, but ultimately, these are somewhat simplistic things to keep in mind as you live in retirement and as you go through, again, reviewing your retirement plan every quarter, every year, whatever it may be. Let's assess where you're at. So again, going back to Helen, what can we can manage her spending. Let's decrease her expenses. That way, in other words, decrease her withdrawal rate. She'll be able to make sure that her money lasts through retirement, or at least improve the likelihood that it will. Second, we can budget for Medicare or health insurance. Again, kind of coming back to slightly different, but that long-term care consideration. These are expenses that are more often than not going to occur in an elderly person's life. And again, factoring that into your retirement plan is really, really important. Again, include health expenses in budget. Kind of touches on that same bullet point right there. Health expenses are a major thing to consider as you age, not only in terms of medications, things like that, but nursery home stays, long-term care, maybe you develop dementia or Alzheimer's. These are things that are going to cost a lot of money if they occur, and unfortunately, they seem to be occurring with a lot more regularity, or at least we're hearing more stories about them. Consider supplemental health insurance. When you're working, you're going to get health insurance more often than not from your employer. And then as you get to a certain age, you're going to be eligible for Medicare, but sometimes Medicare doesn't cover everything. And again, that's not necessarily a conversation for today, but that is something that we consider with all of our clients as they get older and as they start applying for Medicare, and whether that's really going to cover exactly what they need. Now, I will note, I don't sell health insurance or anything like that, but that's something, the costs of it and sort of what it carries is something that needs to be factored in. And then consider long-term care and life insurance. Kind of going back to that leaving a legacy goal that we had mentioned earlier for the preparing for unexpected. Life insurance may be a factor in that. Let's say you want to name a beneficiary for a life insurance policy to be a charity or a church. These are things that are important to note. And again, I don't want to keep emphasizing a point that we've already touched on, but what does your retirement look like? Only you can answer that question, and sort of maybe leaving a legacy is something you want to do, but maybe it's not. Maybe budgeting for healthcare is something you want to do, but maybe it's not, although I should recommend it. So these are things to consider, and especially for Helen in her situation, being worried about outliving her money, these are things that we can consider.
How do you,
Sure.
in terms of budgeting for health expenses,
Mm-hmm.
is there a number people should have in mind? In other words, unexpected health expenses,
Mm-hmm.
how do you what's the nest egg that you need for health expenses and then hope you never need it?
No, you're absolutely right, and especially given the fact that it's not like there's a cap on what that health expense may be. Like, you know, let's say the maximum it would end up being is somewhere in the range of $50,000. There's people that are living in nursing homes for years and that are spending, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars on that, and actually in some instances their children are having to kind of come up and foot the bill for them. And obviously those are terrible circumstances, and we don't like planning for them, and these are not easy conversations to have. But setting aside some money, and again, it all comes back to that withdrawal rate. The more flexibility you have later in your retirement plan, the better. So again, let's say you're in your early 60s and you withdraw 6%. That's not going to hurt you in year 1, but where it may end up hurting you is in year 18, 19, 20, if you do have a major health expense that comes up while you've been withdrawing 6% from your portfolio, and all of a sudden, instead of $750,000, you have $150,000 left, and you have to go to a nursing home, and you only have 10 months worth of stay built into the budget. So again, it comes back to that withdrawal rate and making sure that you have flexibility later on. But there's no set number that nobody knows. And for some people, they may never have any major health expenses that they, as they get older. Obviously that's not likely, but that's going to give them more flexibility, and maybe all of a sudden with the savings that they haven't spent on health expenses, they transfer that to their next of kin with leaving a legacy. Positioning the portfolio for both is a really, really important aspect, and again, those two things being preparing for the expected and then also for the unexpected. So positioning the portfolio for both includes not entirely escaping the concept of growth. And what I mean by that is getting into a little bit more of the numbers of the portfolio. You don't want to entirely get out of growth investments as you age. Obviously, as you age, you want to get a little bit more conservative with your investments because you don't want to lose any of that money. But kind of getting back to your point where you said, let's say the market returns 6% and you withdraw 6%, that incorporating growth investments, at least to a certain extent, is going to ensure that you make enough money so that you're able to generate back what you withdrew. And the general rule of thumb, and it's not perfect for everybody, but it's a rule of thumb that I recommend, is you take your age, subtract it from 100, and that should be the percentage you're allocated towards equities, or in other words, the market. So I would be happy to write that down somewhere, but I'll say it again. 100, subtract your age. That result is how much you should be within the market as a percentage of your portfolio. But again, I can't emphasize the point enough. Growth matters in retirement. Maintain your balance between equities and fixed income. Again, having a good balance between the two is really, really important. Now, for some people that may mean 60-40, some people that may mean 40-60, 30-70, whatever it may be. And again, that kind of comes back to your risk tolerance and how much money you have. You know, if you have $2 million in retirement, maybe you can be a little bit more aggressive because there's the chances that you're going to live, your money's going to outlive you, so to speak. But let's say you're on a little bit more of a budget. Getting a little bit more allocation towards fixed income may be something to consider because you want to preserve that principal as much as possible. And again, it's so case by case that there's not necessarily a number that we can associate with any of these things, but this is something to consider as you develop your retirement plan. And again, coming back to your review. Review. I personally and especially my clients that are nearing or in retirement, I meet with them on a quarterly basis. Some people do annual reviews, and quite frankly, I think that doesn't necessarily satisfy the requirement of checking in with them. I think being a little bit more on top of things, even if it's just a cup of coffee down at Dunkin' Donuts, just to check in, see how they're doing. I think it's really, really important to get in touch with my clients as much as possible. And even other financial advisors, I think that is becoming a little bit more of a regular occurrence, is that they're getting on top of their clients and making sure that their retirement plan looks as it ought to look. I kind of went through that a little quick, but I hope you guys took away some good things. But any questions that you have, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Again, it's just you guys here tonight. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. But I thank you very much for joining me this evening, and hope to see you again sometime.
Any questions? So,
Sure.
we're thinking about ourselves, but our daughter,
Mm-hmm.
25, she should start thinking about retirement now, right? That's
Absolutely. You can't think about, and it's a cliche, but you can't think about retirement soon enough. You really can't. And even if it's something along the lines of putting a few percentage points of her salary towards her 401k, let's say her employer is going to match up to 4%, take advantage of the full match. Maybe allocate some funds towards an IRA. An HSA, health savings account, is a great thing to consider, coming back to the healthcare expenses and using them that way. An HSA, health savings account, is triple tax exempt, which I don't know if that rings a bell with any of you, but so when we're talking about an HSA, you're contributing pre-tax money, so you're not paying taxes on the contributions to an HSA. On the back end, you go to take money out. You're not paying taxes on what you take out, and whatever the growth is within the account over the years, you're not paying taxes on the growth either. So HSAs are a terrific savings tool. Now, they're only eligible to be used for health expenses, so I wouldn't necessarily put all my eggs in one basket with an HSA, but an HSA is a great thing to consider, especially as a younger individual. I contribute to an HSA myself. But you're right, your daughter, even if it's up a couple percentage points, meeting that match from her employer is a really, really good idea. Maybe it's an IRA, something like that, but you're absolutely right. You can't think about retirement soon enough.
Can you contribute to an HSA in retirement?
You can. And it's a little complex because you can up to a threshold. There's a contribution limit, and it's something to consider.
I'm going to look into that. 'Cause I had one when I was working. I'm retired now, so we've kind of preaching to the converted. But yeah, I hadn't thought about that. We had a healthcare spending account when I was working, and that was through my employer. But I wonder if I can do that privately.
Now, obviously, you can do it privately.
Yeah.
One of the ways that an HSA in particular is so beneficial is the growth that occurs over years. So let's say you put in $1,000 just for a round number, and you get a 6% return in 1 year. That's not necessarily going to be exactly the same as a 6% return over 30 years. Do you know what I'm saying? So the benefit may not be quite as much as you have envisioned, but it is something to consider and look into.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Good.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I appreciate you guys coming down.
It's good to kind of, I think in some ways reinforces that we're doing the right things.
Good.
So that's reassuring.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
I'm not going to become a client, but
That's fine.
it was good to come here.
I appreciate you guys coming down.
Hear you, sort of talking us through this. And,
Sure.
Yeah, the key thing is the unexpected. And
Yep.
it's like, how do you plan for the unexpected?
Mm-hmm. The proof that's where the planning comes in.
Yeah.
But it is tough to plan for.
Yeah, you just never know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Ron, Ann, thank you so much for coming down. I really appreciate it. I hope I made the trip worth it.
Yeah, sure, of course.
Good, good.
Because because it puts us in that space.
Yep.
You know, for half an hour, we're thinking it through, listening to you, getting questions, and good. So thanks very
Awesome.
much.
No, thank you. And feel free to pass my cards around to anybody that may be interested.